You don't know how much I wanted to avoid this one today. I thought, surely there's a better text to draw from in this time. I thought, no, the discipline that I've chosen is to preach the lectionary, so I will. And so the title of this sermon is The Air We Breathe. Now, last week I shared a cultural piece of information that, if taken into consideration, would leave the parable open-ended to Jesus' listeners, and I hope you remember that. The parable was about waiting for the return of the bridegroom and seeing how that can be done in either a prepared way or an unprepared way. In the days of Matthew's first audience, following the public execution of Jesus, the limited resurrection appearances, following the Roman destruction of the Jerusalem temple, this parable would have served to instruct that community anxiously awaiting the return of Jesus. Some at that time may have believed that they were living in the last days, an oppressive empire breathing down their necks, having destroyed their temple. Some may have doubted that Jesus would return as he said, maybe becoming cynical or hopeless. All are encouraged through this parable to go on living a prepared faithfulness, remembering this. Jesus said, I will be with you to the end of the age. Now, if this is our truth, that God is with us every day in all circumstances, not abandoning us to walk life's journey alone, then let us bring that understanding and assurance to our hearing of this second parable in Matthew 25. It tells us about the outcome of what 3 slaves do in the absence of their master. This, too, is a teaching about living with the physical absence of Jesus and waiting for his return, just as that parable about the 10 maidens. This follows in the same context. The master in this parable says that he will return, but his slaves have no idea when that will be. Each of them has been entrusted with a certain amount of what belongs to the master. Our modern way of understanding slavery and fairness may bias us against the slaveholder and potentially distract us from the lesson of this parable. Now, the world of Matthew's first audience, they know slavery as a normative. It's just part of the air that they breathe. And so it does not cause an obstacle to them in accepting Jesus as God's Messiah. In fact, it probably adds to that understanding once they come to accept that, or they realize it, or they see it. If we can, then, let's bracket what we think about slavery. Let's focus on what is in the air that we breathe, that we may hear the voice of God in this time and in this place from this parable. We have been called by God. This is part of the air we breathe. We have been called by God, forgiven and befriended by Christ. No longer are we strangers or orphans, but we belong to God. We have a hope and a peace that is eternal because Jesus lives. We have an advocate and a comforter to whom we may turn. We have the Spirit of God that enlivens and sustains God's people. This is the air we breathe. So, life enmeshed in the awareness of God's love is like breathing all of that and more. we would cease to live without breath, would we not? And yet, we so often take breathing for granted. Think about that. In these days of stress and anxiety, breathing may become shallow. We don't even realize how shallow our breath can become at times, reducing the intake of oxygen that our body needs. So what a difference it can make to simply pause for just one moment, take in a deep breath, hold it, and then exhale. How many of you have ever done that? Just for a moment to relieve some stress, just to calm down. Now, did you know the Apple Watch has an app for that? You can set it to the number of breaths per minute you want, and how many times you want it to remind you to do that in a day. Think about it. We have become so busy, so preoccupied with things that are other than what our body actually needs, that there's now a resource to assist us with our healthy habits. Deep breathing can help us to relax, keep us healthier. Now, perhaps spending time with Scripture can be like deep breathing. It can certainly help us cultivate the kinds of thoughts and the awareness of God that we need for spiritual growth. If we are immersed in the awareness of who God is, creating, forgiving, giving, sheltering, sending, oh yes, correcting, then this is what we will bring to our hearing of the parable today. The parable that we heard read this morning is similar to the one that we find in Luke, but it carries the characteristics of Matthew's gospel. Matthew's gospel is concerned with teachings about life in the kingdom and warnings about punishment for those who are not faithful. Matthew's theology is about the end times and a return of the Son of Man. It's pretty clear throughout Matthew, that's what it's about. In the in-between time, however, the followers of Christ are to remain faithful and active, not knowing when Christ may return. Jesus said, "You don't know the hour or the day. Why worry about it? Be faithful." So what the wealthy man decides to entrust to each slave, or what the amount of the return is from each of them, is not the main issue of this teaching. We only have to remember that earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, back in chapter 13, Jesus tells his disciples that those who have will be given more, and from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. I don't know if you remember, he actually said that earlier in the Gospel. And it may have shaken us at that point. Like, what? What? I thought a generous God would give, but this doesn't sound very generous. But it's not about giving amounts of things, so back and forth. That's not what the lesson is. He's talking about when you grasp the truth of his gospel. That is those are spiritual riches. Matthew's gospel tells us that Jesus shares freely, but not all are able to receive what he's sharing. Not all were able to see who Jesus is or accept that God sent him as fulfillment of promise and life. It is meaningful only to those breathing in the air of God's salvation and eternal love. Yes, there's a warning, and there is freedom to choose to follow the way of Christ. That goes on throughout the Gospel of Matthew. But remember the cultural piece I lifted up last week, where in this Middle Eastern culture, saying no once doesn't necessarily end the discussion or the argument, or doesn't necessarily answer what is being proposed or put on the table. And so the fact that we hear this once, hear something once, our 21st century minds want to say, oh, there it is, that's it. But Jesus' audience would have heard this as a dynamic interaction where the first card is played. And it's up to the person hearing it to respond. What will their response be? So yes, it's important that people hear there are consequences to choices. Yes, it's important to hear that there is this side of God that does not wish to see us turn away. And it's proposed in this way of punishment, presented in that way. That can be scary to us, because when we hear somebody tell us, this follows this, period, that's the way our mind works. And yet, in this context, God is saying, it'll be like this if you do that. But if you haven't done that yet, or there's still an opportunity to correct it, that tells the truth of who God is, a God of forgiveness, a God of second chances, a God who wants you to know how great divine love is. That's the gospel. Gospel means good news. That's the kind of God we're talking about. That's the kind of God Jesus was trying to convey or was presenting to the world. We still live with the impact of a deadly pandemic. Some see it as more threatening than others. We still live in a nation divided by many issues, and people fear what they do not understand or cannot control. Friends, take a deep breath. Really, just pause. Take one deep breath. Inhale and exhale. Breathe in the promise of God that you are God's beloved. And exhale the fear of an uncertain day, because you know who holds tomorrow.